Welcome to this Children's Safety Network webinar on the consequences of bullying. I'm Jennifer Allison, the director of the Children's Safety Network, and I'll be moderating today's webinar, in which we'll be learning about the biological and psychosocial consequences of bullying for children who are the perpetrators and targets of bullying, and for those who are bystanders to bullying behavior. This webinar is the first of a three-part series on the findings and recommendations of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine's report called Preventing Bullying Through Science, Policy, and Practice. And upcoming webinars are going to look at bullying prevention law and policy and at bullying prevention interventions. So before we go further, I'm going to quickly review a few technical tips. As you can see here, audio is being broadcast through your computer speakers. And if you're having difficulty getting audio through your computer, please call our phone line at 866-835-7973. And if you are calling in and getting audio through the phone line, you'll just need to remember to mute your computer speakers. And you can submit a question in the Q&A box at any time. You'll see the Q&A box there on the lower left. And we'll address the questions during the Q&A portion of the webinar after we've heard from our presenter. You can also download resources from the file share pod. The report from the National Academies is there in the pod, so you can take a look at that. We're going to keep the phone lines muted throughout the webinar to prevent background noise. We have around 800 people who've registered for today's webinar, so we've got a lot of people listening in. And then finally, I want to let everyone know that this webinar is being recorded, and we'll be sending a link to the archived recording to all those who registered for the webinar. So at this point, I'm going to turn things over to Maureen Perkins, who works on bullying at the Health Resources and Services Administration, and she's going to tell us more about the National Academies report and the impact that the report is having on the field of bullying prevention. Maureen?
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you everyone for joining this webinar hosted by the Children's Safety Network on the consequences of bullying. We'll be hearing from one of the committee members who worked on the National Academies consensus study. And for those of you who may not be familiar, I wanted to provide you with some information about the National Academies. The National Academies are private, nonprofit institutes that provide expert advice on issues and challenges facing our nation. HRSA felt that the findings and recommendations from a study conducted by the National Academies would be an important contribution to the field of bullying prevention. So HRSA, along with other federal agencies and private foundations, funded the National Academies to conduct a consensus study to report on the state of the science on the biological and psychosocial consequences of peer victimization and the risk and protective factors that either increase or decrease peer victimization behavior and consequences. The result of that work is the report we're going to be hearing about today, Preventing Bullying Through Science, Policy, and Practice. And today we'll be discussing the consequences of bullying for children who are the perpetrators and targets, and for those who are the bystanders to bullying behavior. So I'll turn it back over to you, Jennifer. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Maureen. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our presenter, Tracy Vaillancourt. Dr. Vaillancourt is a professor and a Canada Research Chair in Children's Mental Health and Violence Prevention at the University of Ottawa in the Faculty of Education and the School of Psychology, the Faculty of Social Sciences. She's also an elected member of the College of the Royal Society of Canada and on the executive team of the Promoting Relationships and Eliminating Violence Network, or PrevNet. Dr. Vaillancourt's research examines the links between aggression and children's mental health functioning with a particular focus on the neurobiology of peer victimization. Her research is currently funded by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and the Ontario Mental Health Foundation. So Tracy, I will turn things over to you, and you can proceed with your presentation.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone participating in today's webinar. Before talking about the consequences of bullying, I'm first going to start off with some information about the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine's report on preventing bullying through science, policy, and practice. So just make sure I get the right slides here. Okay. So first we'll deal with the report sponsors. I guess I'm having a little bit of trouble with my slides here. Just one second. I'm one slide too quickly. Okay, so just speaking first about our study sponsors, so the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute for Child and Health Development, Health Resources and Service Administration, National Institute of Justice, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, the Samuel J. and Ruth Begun Foundation, and the Highmark Foundation. So there are a lot of sponsors involved in this really important report. We also had a wonderful committee that was interdisciplinary. Angela, Catherine, Daniel, Sandra, Mark, Matthew, Megan, Fred, Regina, Jonathan, and myself. My colleagues for this report are all very accomplished scholars in their respective fields of study, so it was really nice working with these individuals. And we had a great team that worked with us too. So the study staff was wonderful. They helped keep us on task, got this report out on time, and so really important teamwork here. And here's where our expertise came from. So we had expertise in education, community technology, school administration, clinical and developmental psychology, pediatrics, mental health, law and policy, neurobiological development, criminology. And now we'll talk about the consequences of bullying. So before we get to that, we just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. So I'm going to first give a brief overview of the report, and then I'll get into what the consequences are, what we found in the report. There are many things that in the past were viewed as normal part of life. Bullying, unfortunately, has long been considered by many as a rite of passage, a normal part of growing up. But the evidence to date doesn't support that bullying builds character or makes kids stronger or more resilient. In fact, the evidence, which I'm going to present today, suggests that bullying impacts individuals across a variety of domains of functioning, both immediately and in the long term. Given its potential for derailing potential, we need to figure out how to prevent bullying and what educational programs, state and local policies and rule changes are necessary to do so. We also need to do a better job of caring for people affected by bullying in order to prevent its long-reaching negative impact. Our group was tasked with conducting a consensus study and producing a comprehensive report on the state of the science, with a particular focus on the biological and psychosocial consequences of peer victimization and the risk and protective factors that either increase or decrease peer victimization and its consequences. We had a particular focus on children who are most at risk for peer victimization, those with high risk factors in combination with very few or few protective factors, such as children with disabilities, LGBT youth, poly victims, and children living in poverty. Toward this aim, we did an extensive review of the research literature on bullying, and we focused on the following questions. What is the state of research on neurobiological, mental, and behavioral health effects of bullying? What is known about the physiological and psychosocial consequences of bullying for both perpetrators and targets? How are individuals and other characteristics related to the dynamic between perpetrators and targets, short and long-term outcomes for both we were interested in? And what factors contribute to resilient outcomes in youth exposed to and involved in bullying? There are a variety of definitions of bullying that are out there, and some do not include cyberbullying. The committee chose to use a current definition for bullying developed by the CDC, which defines bullying as any unwanted aggressive behavior by another youth or group of youth who are not siblings or currently dating partners that involves an observed or perceived power imbalance and is repeated multiple times or is highly likely to be repeated. Bullying may inflict harm or distress on the targeted youth, including physical, psychological, social, or educational harm. So we wanted to make sure we kept this definition in mind, and this definition basically says that bullying is a systematic abuse of power. So what is the state of the problem? National surveys suggest that bullying behavior is common and affects a large number of American youth. Collating these national statistics yields prevalence rates of 7 to 15% for cyberbullying and 18 to 31% for school-based bullying. Note that most of the reports focused on bullying victimization and not perpetration. In fact, most of the report focused on bullying victimization and not perpetration, as most of the evidence is on victims of bullying and not perpetrators. Trends in bullying over time, as reported in national surveys, suggest slight improvement. And you can see from this graph, there are multiple national surveys that we looked at, and they seem to be pointing in the better direction. It doesn't look like it's far enough down, but at least it's going down, it seems. Trends in cyberbullying suggest some improvement as well, although not all supported by all surveys. It's important to note, however, that these national surveys are not, although they suggest they're longitudinal and suggest that we can talk about change, they don't examine the same children over time. So they are cross-sectional in nature. The committee identified that some groups are more vulnerable than others. For example, the prevalence of bullying of lesbian, gay, and bisexual males and females ranged from 25.6 to 43.6%. A growing body of research examined the experience of transgendered youth specifically and suggests that most transgendered youth experience regular bullying and harassment at school. For instance, in a sample of 5,542 adolescents sampled online, 82% of transgendered or gendered nonconforming youth reported bullying experiences in the past 12 months. And this is compared to 57% among cisgender boys and girls. Youth with disabilities were also abused by their peers more often than their non-disabled peers. In fact, 1.5 times as much. There's also evidence that obese youth are treated poorly by their peers, although more work is needed to understand how obesity interacts with other factors to confer a risk for being bullied. Other risk factors were also examined, but the research to date is inconclusive. And unfortunately, the research on bullying is largely still descriptive. And this type of research, being descriptive in nature, does not permit for a full consideration of how contextual factors affect bullying. This paucity is actually problematic because children are nested within families and communities and societies, and these systems can act as risk factors or protective factors and can also interact with one another in complicated ways. So the complicated nature of these interactions we felt were not really found in the research we were looking at. Again, it was largely descriptive in nature. Indeed, we need to be looking at these types of complex relations because community norms, neighborhood, and acculturation can serve as important moderators of bullying outcomes. And individual variables such as age and gender, personality, and social status, as well as classroom norms favoring the bully or the victim, can affect roles in bullying situations. Moreover, because bullying is a group phenomenon, with multiple peers taking on roles other than being the perpetrator or the target, it's also important to consider the role peers play as they influence norms and attitudes and behavior. For example, there's research to show that in classrooms where peer victimization emerges as central, so that is in classrooms with very few victims, the negative impact of being victimized on mental health outcomes is greater than in classrooms where many children are bullied. Presumably, the isolated victim or victims attribute their plight to personal shortcomings, whereas children in classrooms with many victims likely attribute their abuse to something being wrong with the perpetrator. So what are the consequences of bullying? Well, first it's important to note that we know, again, I've said this before, but I really want to highlight it, that we know far more about the consequences of those who are targeted than those who perpetrate the abuse. Still, bullying is associated with academic difficulties, school truancy and avoidance, increased absenteeism, somatic complaints, stress-related illness, physical health problems, low self-esteem, depression, psychosis, social withdrawal and isolation, social anxiety, loneliness, suicide, and aggressive behavior, to name but a few consequences. Although the list seems long, it seems to be that bullying affects almost every aspect of a person's life. The effects of bullying indeed impact multitude domains of functioning. Particularly concerning is the link between bullying perpetration and victimization and suicidal ideation and behavior due to increased mental health problems. Although there's not enough evidence to date to conclude that bullying is a causal factor for youth suicide, there is definitely some evidence to support a link, including meta-analytic findings. There's also not enough evidence to date to conclude that bullying is a causal factor in school shootings. Also troubling is research showing that high-status bullies, so bullies who are popular and are perceived as leaders in their school, that they rank high on assets and competencies that the peer group values, such as being attractive or being a good athlete. These high-status perpetrators rank low on psychopathology and use aggression to achieve and maintain hegemony. We also found in our report that individuals who bully others and are bullied, so bully victims, are at greatest risk for poor psychosocial outcomes compared to those who are only bullied or only bully others or are not bullied. That is, on all indicators examined, bullied victims fared the worst. Finally, bullying negatively impacts the negative impact of bullying is immediate and can have long-lasting effects that persist even after bullying has stopped. So for example, I'll give you two recent examples. In a recent study published in the American Journal of Psychiatry, the effects of childhood bullying were found 50 years after the fact. Victims of frequent bullying in childhood had higher rates of depression, anxiety, and suicidality than their non-bullied peers 5 decades after. Moreover, the effects were similar to being exposed to other childhood adversities, such as being placed in public or substitute care. In another recent study published in the flagship journal, The Lancet, researchers found that being the victim of bullying in childhood was associated with poor mental health in adulthood. In this study, they examined anxiety, depression, and self-harm and suicidality, and also created a composite for overall mental health problems. The negative impact of bullying was in fact greater than the impact of being maltreated by caregivers. So if you just look at the odds ratios in that box, what you see is that compared to the reference group of somebody who's not involved, if you were only maltreated, your mental health outcomes were 1.7 times greater. If you were maltreated by your caregiver and bullied, they were 3.5 times greater than if you were not abused in any way. However, if you were only bullied, your mental health problems were 4.7 times greater in adulthood as a consequence of being treated poorly by your peers during childhood. The strength of this study was that the effects were replicated across 2 population-based studies from 2 different countries. So that's pretty impressive. The Great Smoky Mountain Study, which is a longitudinal population-based community survey of children and adolescents in North Carolina, was used as one study, and the other study was the Avon Longitudinal Study of Parents and Children, which is a study of families from the Bristol area in England. There is also emerging research suggesting that bullying can result in biological changes. And these changes are actually discussed in greater detail in another Children's Safety Network webinar entitled Bullying Gets Under Your Skin, which I encourage you all to check out. For example, there are changes in the stress response system and in the brain that are associated with being bullied that can increase the risk for mental health problems, memory deficits, self-regulation issues, and other physical health problems. Although research on the neurobiology of peer victimization is increasing, at this point, the committee concluded that the effects of bullying on the brain are not yet fully understood. So we need a lot more research in this area, and this is actually my area of expertise. This is the stuff I study where I'm interested in how bullying gets under the skin to confer a risk for poorer health outcomes. This research seems to be suggesting that bullying does impact a person's biology in a way that likely increases their risk for future health and academic problems. And I'll just give you one example. So in this study, this is a study that I did with some of my colleagues. It's a longitudinal study that involves children who were 12 at time 1 and followed every 6 months on 4 occasions. We found that bullying led to depression, replicating other studies and something that has been consistently shown in meta-analyses. Depression in turn led to dysregulation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. This is the body's stress response system, and it's indexed using cortisol. So when a person activates their HPA axis, typically you see a spike in their cortisol. And cortisol is good in the immediate moment because it gets you ready for the stressor at hand. But if you're consistently bathing your body and your brain with cortisol, it's associated with negative effects. In this study, I was interested in how it relates to memory because high cortisol has been shown to impair memory in animal studies and in human studies. And this is exactly what we found. We found that elevated cortisol, the stress hormone, impacted memory in children who were bullied. So the children were bullied, they became depressed, it affected their HPA axis, this in turn affected their memory. Although we could not link it to their academic functioning, it's interesting to note, as I said before, that children who are bullied have problems with academic performance. In sum, the committee concluded that bullying negatively impacts targets and perpetrators, although we know far more about targets than we do about perpetrators. We also found that it has a damaging effect that is far, far reaching. It virtually impacts all aspects of an individual. It also impacts, beyond impacting multiple domains of functioning, it has an immediate effect on the individual, but it also has an effect on individuals in the long term, long after the bullying has stopped. To learn more about the committee or to access the report, which I think is brilliant, I'm not just saying it because I'm one of the authors. I think we did a really good job on this. You can visit our website, and it's right there on the slide. You could also help us spread the word on social media using the hashtag Science on Bullying or Bullying Prevention. And you could also look for us at the following conference to hear more about the report. So we're going to be talking more in depth about this at the International Bullying Prevention Association Conference in New Orleans in November. So that concludes my talk, the first of a 3-part series about this report, and I look forward to hearing about your questions.
Okay, thanks very much, Tracy. Great information. And we are going to transition now to the question and answer portion of our webinar. So for folks who are listening in, if you have a question, feel free to type it into the Q&A box, which you'll see on the lower left-hand side of your screen. We have some questions coming in, so I'm going to go ahead and pose those to you, Tracy. So one of the questions that we've received is, Are the numbers that you shared on the prevalence of bullying, are those reflective of Canadian youth or American youth or both? And are there national differences in these numbers that you've observed?
The report focused on, when we use the prevalence, when we report on prevalence in the report, we focused on American youth. And the reason being is that, I mean, the National Academies is an American entity, and your target is Americans. So, but having said that, I'm very familiar with the Canadian statistics, and they map on pretty closely. If you look at the, some of the world comparisons, the Americans fare better than the Canadians on bullying prevalence rates. So our rates are a little bit higher on perpetration and victimization in Canada. Also, when you look at the world reports, what you tend to see is that the Americans are doing better at reducing their numbers, their prevalence rates, whereas the Canadians, our rates aren't reducing. So we're sharing that privilege with the United Kingdom, and for some reason our numbers aren't moving as quickly or in the right direction. So the report focuses on American youth. They're quite similar to what we see with Canadians, although Canadians' prevalence rates are just a little bit higher.
All right, thanks. Another question that we've received is, what are poly victims?
Yeah, you know what, I apologize. I should have actually defined that when I was saying the word. I thought I really need to be saying something here. So polyvictimization is being victimized in different ways. So when we looked at the slide about child maltreatment, that would be a polyvictim because the person's being abused by their caregiver and by their peers. So it would be somebody who would be victimized also by not just caregivers, but intimate partner violence and things like that.
Okay. Thanks. That's very helpful. And then an additional question here. If you could talk about the kind of effects that bullying had on the perpetrators. What do we know about that?
Most of it, when you look at the long-term effects of bullying on the perpetrators, it depends on their status level, and that's partly why I wanted to highlight that there's this group of individuals who are high-status bullies. And the evidence coming out from that group of individuals is that they tend to be doing all right. And I mean, you know, it's a little disheartening that because you have somebody who's impacting somebody's life in such a negative way and there seems to be no effect on them. So there's a group of individuals who bully others who are high status. They're very popular in their school, and they seem to do well on mental health outcomes. And there's even some longitudinal studies showing that they seem to do all right in adulthood. But there's another group of individuals who bully others who are more dysregulated, who are more reactive in their use of aggression, and they're not faring as well. So they're more likely to have externalizing problems like ADHD, oppositional defiance disorder, conduct disorder, and in the future, they're more likely to abuse substances. They're also more likely to abuse people in their lives. So you'll see them being involved in intimate partner violence and child abuse and things like that. So it's not to suggest that they're all faring well, individuals who bully others, but it depends on their social status. Well, it seems to depend on their social status. So we really need to be thinking about heterogeneity because not all kids who bully others are the same and have the same pathway. And just like not all targeted kids have the same outcomes and same, you know, beginning and outcomes.
Okay, thanks. Then how can the victim of bullying become more resilient? Are there protective factors that we should be supporting that would help victims to not experience such severe consequences from being bullied?
It's interesting because when I presented the information about how there was this one study where if you were an isolated victim in your classroom, you didn't fare that well, whereas if there were a lot of victims in your classroom, you seemed to fare better. And those kids that are suffering alone and suffering in silence seem to not be doing so well. And I mean, you could think if you take that to the next level, you would think, well, the implication for that is that we need more kids to be victimized. And that's not at all what we should be suggesting. But what we need to do is to support victims. Oftentimes we want victims to fix this on their own. And when you think about the definition of bullying, I said it was a systematic abuse of power. It's about somebody abusing them who has way more power than they do. If they could make this stop, they would make it stop. And they've tried, and they've tried. And so what we need is adults involved. We need peers that are not involved in bullying to stand up for them. And I think we need to take the onus off the individual who's being victimized. Their fundamental right to be spared from oppression and humiliation is being violated. And so it's time we stand with them.
Okay, thank you. Additional question here. Can you describe the difference between saying bullying has consequences versus saying that there aren't really causal links? So I mean, this might be scientists splitting hairs a little bit, but they're important hairs to split. So when we talk about causal link, we are saying that we've controlled for things like, for example, if I want to say that bullying causes depression, I first need to control for the fact that depression may have been present before. So you got to look at the unique pathway moving forward, holding constant depression. And then you need to test also empirically the opposite direction. So there's research, and it's actually highlighted in the report too. There's a subset of children who actually start off depressed, become bullied because they're depressed, and then the bullying then exacerbates their symptomology that they had to begin with. So that pathway is more uncommon than the pathway from being well, getting bullied, and becoming depressed. So that's what we mean by a causal pathway. You have to meet these scientific principles, these standards in order to say that something's causal. The research that I reviewed, and I don't know if the committee didn't come out saying this, I think they're probably, well, they are a little bit more conservative, and I think that's an important thing to be, is conservative in your interpretation of science. The research seems to suggest that there's a causal link between being bullied and having poorer outcomes, but we need more research in order to say that definitively. So when you say the opposite, when you're saying there's a consequence, that could just be a correlate. But, typically when we're saying consequences, we're trying to establish this temporal priority or sequence. So, I mean, that might have been really long-winded, but, the research tends to be pushing towards towards the conclusion that bullying causes harm to children, both immediately and in the long term. Yeah. All right.
And unfortunately, I lost my connection to our slide deck and everything, so I'm not seeing the questions come out, so I really appreciate you telling me them.
Sure, no problem. Yeah, I'll continue to read them aloud here. We've got a lot of great questions coming in. In fact, another really good question from one of our participants is, did you study the impact of bullying on the bystander and how long they can be affected by seeing bullying, and whether they report it or not to a trusted adult?
So the thing about bystanders, we have a little bit in the report, and in the report it's mostly about how we need to be leveraging bystanders a little bit more. I can't remember offhand if we have this in the report, but I do know that some of my colleagues have done this research, and there is some evidence to support that even witnessing people being bullied affects children's depression rates and mental health in other areas. So, it's not inconsequential to see people being harmed in front of you and not doing anything. So I feel like that part, there's not, I do recall there wasn't a lot of research on that, on bystanders, but it seems to be an area that's increasing. People are more interested in it. Scientists are doing a bit more work, and the committee recognized the importance of that. So if you go to the chapter where we talk about interventions and preventions, which I think is the third webinar in this series, that's where bystanders are discussed and how they should be used, and what can, how we can ameliorate people's lives by having people stand up and not stand by.
Okay. Another one of our participants is asking about bullying and substance abuse. Does bullying lead to substance abuse? Is there any data on bullying and substance abuse?
There is. So you'll see there'll be correlational studies, so where you're looking at it in one point in time. So let's say grade 10 students, exposure to bullying in terms of perpetration and victimization and the increased use of substances, and there's evidence to support that. And then there's also about, I want to say 5 to 7 longitudinal studies that looked at the impact of childhood bullying on substance use and abuse in adulthood. And there's a good review paper that I did with my colleague Patty McDougall that's published in American Psychologist that just came out in the last year, and we reviewed these data, these studies, and what we found was there was a link between exposure to bullying and subsequent substance use and abuse in adulthood. And mostly it seemed to be it affected perpetrators more than victims. So I mentioned before that perpetrators seem to be more externalizing in their mental health problems, and individuals who are targeted by bullying seem to be more internalizing. So they tend to have issues with depression and anxiety, whereas perpetrators tend to have problems with emotional self-regulation, substance use and abuse, and other aggressive issues.
Okay, and then we have another question here about the consequences for perpetrators of bullying. And the question is, are there positive changes if the bully perpetrator is punished for their behavior?
Well, so the report came out pretty strongly on how we punish individuals who are involved in bullying, right? So we came with the conclusion, we arrived at the conclusion that zero tolerance policies don't work. And I'm proud of that, the fact that we said that, and we said it as plainly as I just did right now. I think it really depends on how they're being dealt with. So one thing I think we tend to do is we, in a sense, the individual who's bullying others, it becomes an entity. So we call them bullies and we think this is all they are, right? Without recognizing that these are children and youth who need our help and need better guidance on how to be appropriate with their peers. So there is some evidence. So for example, there was a study that looked at, that was published in Prevention Science, looking at how school principals dealt with those who had been identified as bullying others. And what they found was, it's just one example, that having a relationship with the parents, so having them called into the office for a meeting with the staff, reduced the number of incidents of bullying, and that was more effective than just giving them a school suspension or suspension in the office or things like that. So building relationships with these families, building relationships with the perpetrators is probably going to go a lot further than just simply saying, you're out of the classroom now, you sit here, don't do it again.
Okay, and then do individuals who bully others tend to bully or show bullying behaviors as adults? Is the bullying behavior something that is restricted to childhood or adolescence and disappears later, or does it continue?
That's a great question. So there is some evidence that there's continuity in bullying behavior. So in childhood, it may be directed towards peers, and as they get older, then it may be directed towards their romantic partners, and in adulthood, it could be directed towards co-workers, their spouse, their children. So there's some work that was done by Deb Pepler and Wendy Craig that looked at this and showed there was continuity. There's also a fairly famous study done by Dan Olveus, where he looked at boys who were identified in grade 9 as bullies. And what he found was that by age 24, 60% had already had one criminal conviction. So there was enormous continuity in that case. But the more recent studies are showing that we need to be thinking about kids who bully and their social status. We need to be thinking about that interaction. Again, it seems to be that the marginalized children who bully others, who are really poor on self-regulation fare really poorly in the future. So they're involved in aggression across the lifespan. Whereas there's another group of individuals who abuse their power, but have a lot of assets and competencies that the peer group value. They tend to be afforded high social status. Their mental health profiles look good, and I imagine they probably still abuse power in adulthood, but it seems to have less of a cost to themselves. It absolutely has a cost to the victims. I mean, that's a cost that's borne to the victims at an enormous, it's a really hurtful cost. But so it's a bit complicated in that. I think that I'm pretty sure on the science that our earlier studies were identifying these really poorly regulated individuals who bullied others, and there was a lot of continuity in terms of their bullying behavior across the lifespan.
Okay, very interesting. Then another question here: do you have any information on people that are both they're both targets of bullying and also perpetrators of bullying?
Yes, and so that group, I guess the more pejorative term would be bully victims, and that's how they're identified in the literature. So those who are both targeted and those who bully others, there's quite a bit of research coming out on that group of individuals, and they're not doing well at all. So if you look at all indicators, they are faring the worst. So they are actually more aggressive than those who are just pure bullies. And their psychosocial outcomes are worse than those who are perpetrators or victimized or not involved. So our most at-risk group are those who both bully others and are bullied. And they represent a fairly small percentage of children involved in bullying. Depends on the studies, but I'd say between 2 and 5% of individuals who are involved in bullying are both perpetrators and victims. So anyhow, but they're not doing well at all, and they're not doing well both in the short term and in the long term.
Okay.
And then also, I should probably also add, there's some emerging research that looks at how a person gets onto that pathway. So for example, we published a study, and there's a few other scholars who've done a similar study where we followed individuals over time. And what it seems to be is that first individuals start off their trajectory as victims of bullying, and then they become perpetrators. And I tend to think about two reactions to being bullied. Some children, many children, get sad and they internalize it, and then you see problems like depression and anxiety, somatic complaints, and the list that we went over before. And then there's another group of children who get bullied who get mad. So they in turn become the perpetrator of bullying. And we need more studies that look at these pathways, because if we want to derail them in the right way, if we want to intervene, we have to reduce the number of perpetrators. You reduce the number of perpetrators, you then in turn reduce the number of victims.
All right. Then a question about gender differences in bullying behavior. So have you found that females bully more than males, or males more than females? What does the data show around that?
So the data show that boys are involved in bullying more than girls, as bullies, victims, bully victims. So in any capacity in involvement, they're involved more than girls. So there was a meta-analysis that was done not too long ago that looked at this, and it found good evidence, fairly strong evidence, that boys are more involved than girls.
Okay, and then another participant here has a question about how the U.S. compares to other countries in bullying among adolescents. Is there data on that?
Yeah, there are. So you actually fare fairly well. if you look at the Healthy Behavior Survey as one example, and they compare, so this is well done. This is done by the World Health Organization, and they have a survey that they give to the most economically advanced nations in the world. And UNICEF then puts out these reports. So if you just put in your Google search, UNICEF bullying report card, you're going to get a report card that's done every 2 years that compares countries. So it compares the most economically advanced countries. And the countries with the lowest perpetration tend to be Scandinavian countries. So Sweden tends to be at the top. Finland's at the top too, although that's not a Scandinavian country, but Northern European countries tend to do well. And they prioritize relationships in schools quite differently than North Americans do. And then you have the U.S. is typically in that top third of being on the lowest end of the continuum. And then you see Canada on the bottom third. So the Americans are doing all right. We can absolutely do better. When you think about how awful this experience is for kids, I mean, 1% is even too high in my opinion. But they're doing better than the United Kingdom, Canada, but they're not doing as well as Sweden, for example.
Okay. Yeah, helpful to have that broader context.
And these are, again, these are great reports. They're great report cards. They do a really good job because everything's standardized in how they collect the data in every country.
Great. All right. And then is there a specific time in life where bullying will have a more costly consequence?
Oh, what a terrific question. And actually that's the foundation of a grant that I just received to look at. We actually don't know that. I would have thought we would know more about sensitive periods because we tend to know about sensitive periods about everything. Sensitive periods about language development and motor ability and you name it. We pretty much have child development mapped fairly well where we know when, if things are going to go wrong, this is not when they should go wrong. And we don't know that about bullying. So I would hypothesize that being bullied at a time when it's developmentally atypical will probably lead to poorer outcomes. That's a hypothesis that I'm borrowing just from when you think about, again, that study where with as few victims in the classroom, you fare poorer. So I'm thinking about if you're in high school, at the end of high school, and you're still getting bullied by a lot of people all the time, I can't imagine that's going to go well for a lot of individuals who have that experience, just simply because bullying decreases as children age. Whereas perhaps in middle school where we see bullying peaking, maybe being bullied at that time in your life, although again, not appropriate, not something I wouldn't want us to not challenge. We definitely should be challenging this and not allowing it to happen. But I would hypothesize that the experience in middle school perhaps won't have as long of an impact as it will in later in high school because again it's developmentally atypical to be bullied at the end of high school. But we don't know. So these are just my musings. I don't know. There's not a lot of evidence looking at this sort of thing. There is some evidence suggesting that when you look at a lot of people want to think that cyberbullying, for example, is worse than being physically bullied. What the research suggests there is that it's not the type of bullying that you receive, it's the severity that you receive. So it doesn't matter if you're cyberbullied or physically bullied, it's how often you're bullied, how severe that bullying is, that is related to poorer outcomes for children.
All right. And then are there ways that those who are being bullied, their behaviors they exhibit contribute to the bullying behavior of others, if any?
So are you asking, are there risk factors that would increase the likelihood that somebody gets bullied?
Yeah, I think that's what this question is getting at. Yeah.
Okay, so in the report we identified that there are certain groups that are more vulnerable. So one group that's particularly vulnerable is youth who identify as transgendered, right? So they're very vulnerable. They get bullied a lot, and I mean, they're in that one study, over 80% of them had said they'd been bullied in the last year. We also know from the report that LGBTQ students are more at risk, that children who are obese are more at risk, that children who have disabilities are more at risk. There was some earlier research suggesting that children who are shy and withdrawn were more at risk. This is again coming from Dan Olvea's study, the one that I told you about, how they identified boys in grade 9 and how they were more likely to have a criminal conviction at the age of 24. So there's some research coming out from his early studies in Norway and Sweden suggesting that being shy and socially withdrawn was related to that. But all that said, what's problematic with this research, I mean, it's important to look at and identify groups that are particularly vulnerable, and that's one thing we were really sensitive to. But again, ultimately, the person should be spared from oppression and humiliation. It's their fundamental democratic right. So, you know, regardless of what characteristics they have, they do not deserve this abuse.
Okay, and then have you found that cyberbullying is worse in youth who are younger, middle school as compared to high school?
I wasn't personally responsible for the cyberbullying part. I think I know a lot about bullying, but the cyberbullying stuff, I'm going to just take a guess on this and just going to be really frank about this. From my recollection from the report, that the more you use a technology, the more likely you are to be victimized. So third grade students don't use social media that much, so their exposure or their likelihood of being bullied is less, whereas high school students who use it all the time are more likely to fall victim or to perpetrate abuse online.
Okay. An additional question here. Are there any strategies that you can suggest to parents of children who've been bullied to help them undo the damage that bullying has done to their child?
It's a great question, and it's a great question because we tend to focus on the negative, and I'm guilty of that today too. So I talked about the scary things that happen to kids who are bullied and how these can have a long-lasting effect even 50 years after the fact. But there's also a lot of evidence to suggest that there are protective factors. So for example, family functioning moderates the relationship between being bullied and having poor or better outcomes. So children who are in families that validate them and love them and engage in positive parenting practices, their children do better when they're bullied than those who come from more chaotic families who are less supportive. So when you're asking as a parent what can you do if your child's being bullied, you can support them, you can advocate for them, you know, those sorts of things are going to be really important. What we don't want is children to be mandated to attend school and have a horrible experience there and then come home and have an equally horrible experience at home. It would be ideal if they had great relations with everyone, but I'm particularly troubled by those who just can't, you know, nobody's cutting them a break. So being supportive, advocating for your child, those are going to be really important things for their outcomes.
Yeah, it makes sense. Okay, and then another question around zero tolerance. So this person says, you said that zero tolerance doesn't work. Aside from meeting with parents, can you suggest any other policies for schools that would be effective?
So this, there's going to be that, the final webinar is going to be by Catherine Bradshaw, and she knows this like nobody else. This was her part of the report. She was very knowledgeable about this. So I think I'm the neurobiologist and the person who's on conference. So I don't want to give advice that's less than perfect or less than evidence-based. So I'm going to just defer that to the next webinar, and I apologize to the person who's asking that, but I think it would be more responsible of me to not suggest something that I'm just guessing at.
Okay, that's fine. We'll save that question for the other webinar. There's a question here about the percentage of children who are perpetrators of bullying who've been abused or mistreated. Is that a factor in being a perpetrator of bullying?
So the research on this is a little bit more difficult too, because when people look at child maltreatment, they typically don't ask about their experiences with bullying. And when we do bullying studies, we typically do them in schools, and school boards absolutely don't want us to ask about child maltreatment. So our knowledge about how these two areas of abuse intersect is quite limited. The study that, if you recall from that one study where they had the Great Smoky Mountain study and the Avon longitudinal study of parent and children, those are unique studies in that they have child maltreatment measured and they have bullying, perpetration, and victimization measured, but they're rare. So I don't think we could say, definitively that the percentage of children who are bullied is this and in the face of maltreatment. But I can say this from the studies, and they're not that many, there's probably a handful of studies, that children who are abused at home are unfortunately more likely to be bullied by their peers. So these poor children, right, they have really poor experiences at home, and it'd be great if they could just have somebody could cut them a break when they go to school, but it seems to be the case more often than not they're bullied by their peers if they're also treated poorly at home.
All right, and I think we have time for probably one more question here since we're getting close to the top of the hour. So I'm wondering if you can say more about what kind of research you feel should be done next in terms of furthering our understanding the consequences of bullying, where you think the research should go, and some of the critical questions that need to be answered to really advance our understanding further about consequences of bullying.
I love this question. I love this question because it's what I think about most days. I think we need to know more about mechanisms and processes. So we need to understand more about what moderates and mediates these pathways. So we need to get away from the descriptive studies where we just do a correlation between, let's say, body weight, so body mass index, and bullying experiences. I mean, that stuff's important, but we also need to understand why there's this link. We also need to understand timing. So we need to understand how severity works, but we also need to know about sensitive periods or critical periods, and we don't know anything about that. So we need longitudinal studies that begin before kids enter school, and we follow them all the way into adulthood. And they need to be sufficiently large because they need to capture all of the heterogeneity that we know exists in American society and in Canadian society and society in general. So we need very large longitudinal studies so that we can actually make these inferences about causal pathways. So is it indeed the case that kids become depressed because they're bullied? Or if there's another subgroup, like I said, that we've identified a subgroup of children who follow more of a symptoms-driven pathway where they begin depressed, they become bullied, then they become even more depressed. We need to understand all these different pathways. And if we understand these pathways and these processes and mechanisms, then I actually think we're going to be in a better position of intervening. So what's going to be a little bit of a heartbreaker is when you go to the third webinar and you hear that a lot of times our bullying prevention and intervention programs don't work. And I believe that they don't work because our science isn't sophisticated enough. We've only been studying bullying for the past few decades. We don't know enough about it in order to intervene appropriately. So when that science grows up and we have a better understanding of processes and mechanisms and longitudinal pathways and priorities, I think we're going to be in a good position to do better by children.
Okay, thank you. I think that's a perfect note on which to conclude. And Tracy, I really want to thank you. I think this has been fascinating. I want to also thank our participants for joining us for this webinar and for posing such interesting questions. I think this has been a really, really good discussion. And I just want to let folks know that we have a short evaluation form. We'd really appreciate everyone filling that out. It's very helpful to us in planning future webinars, including the webinars in this bullying prevention series. And then, speaking of the series, the next webinar will be coming up on August 24th, 3 to 4 Eastern Time, and the topic will be bullying prevention law and policy. So there's a link here where you can register right now to attend that webinar. We hope you'll join us for that. All right, I think that's it. We're at 4 o'clock, so we'll close this webinar and look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks so much, everyone.